The Sprint Backlog is a forecast created by the developers in order to meet the sprint goal. It is owned by them. Nobody, not the product owner nor the Scrum Master, can make any changes to the Sprint Backlog. Notice that I use the word forecast. The plan itself, i.e. the Product Backlog Items, is simply a forecast that developers think need to be completed to achieve the sprint goal. They do not actually commit to individual Product Backlog Items. The commitment of the Sprint Backlog is the single sprint goal, collaboratively defined in the sprint planning event. This is important because during sprint planning, where the Sprint Backlog is created, we are precisely at the point in a sprint where the least is known about the outcome. Therefore, we set a hypothesis, a question, a potential value to be delivered in the form of a sprint goal that is committed to. But developers don't commit as to how it will be achieved. Therefore, the developers make an informed prediction about what is needed in the form of the Sprint Backlog, but as they learn more throughout the sprint, throughout their daily scrums or through optional refinement, they will adapt their Sprint Backlog as necessary to make it more likely they will meet the sprint goal. So far, I know I've referred to the Sprint Backlog as the plan created by the developers to meet the sprint goal. However, it isn't just that. The Sprint Backlog is the combination of the sprint goal itself, the Product Backlog Items forecast to be needed, and the plan for how the developers intend to turn those Product Backlog Items into a done increment. It's important that stakeholders and everyone that communicates with the developers understands that the plan can change. When this happens, it is the accountability of the developers to make the changes transparent. Now, earlier in this video, I mentioned that the only people that can change the Sprint Backlog are the developers, and this is true. However, like the developers may attempt to influence the product owner to change the product backlog based on their observations, the product owner may attempt to influence the developers to change the sprint backlog based on their observations. The important part is the developers don't have to change it. The primary single focus of the sprint is the sprint goal. It is the coherence that the developers have committed to and work to achieve. They shouldn't make any adaptations that endanger it. Let's take a pause and try something out. I want you to set yourself a sprint goal to plan a romantic day out for your partner. I want you to imagine that the sprint goal is this: to give my partner a romantic day out that makes them happy. I know this sounds really simple, but I want you to try and write down a few independent product backlog items that may be needed to achieve that sprint goal of to give my partner a romantic day out that makes them happy. Pause the video now and give that a go. What you will find through the activity are a few things. The first of which is that there will be different ways to achieve that sprint goal, but still achieve the same outcome of making your partner happy. I would imagine you may have included in your sprint backlog product backlog items such as arrange a location for lunch, buy a gift, reserve a hotel in a picturesque location. All of those are perfectly valid product backlog items. I would be very surprised though if you came up with exactly the same as me. And that's exactly the point of a sprint goal. The developers understand the value requested by the product owner, but they are afforded flexibility in how they can achieve that goal. Finally, sprint goals can be measured to have or have not been met. In our overly simplified example, you could ask your partner at the end of the day whether or not they are happy. If they are, the sprint goal has been met. What we are trying to do by having a sprint goal is avoid the developers fragmenting into different working initiatives. We want them to work together. As the sprint goal is the commitment of the sprint, it may mean that the developers will need to self-manage and reallocate themselves during the sprint if the sprint goal looks like it is in danger of not being met. And there is almost a hidden piece of information there, and that is that not everything that enters a sprint backlog needs to contribute towards the sprint goal. There is the reality that sometimes small pieces of work just need to be completed. Perhaps you need to write a document to help with advertising. Perhaps you notice a spelling mistake in your logo. Those are two things that aren't large enough to take the place of a whole sprint goal, but they are important nonetheless. The important thing is that the sprint goal is the next tactical step towards the product goal and creates the flexibility and space for creativity for the developers to collaborate on. The majority of them should be working on the sprint goal. As the sprint progresses, it is not uncommon for the developers to learn something that means the work turns out to be different than expected. In this case, they collaborate with the product owner to determine how to adapt the scope of the sprint without impacting the sprint goal. Notice that the sprint goal does not change. This adaptation and collaboration with the product owner is perhaps more common when critical work emerges during the sprint. In a technical environment, this may be support queries or major incidents. In these cases, the sprint goal remains intact. However, there is collaboration on scope of the sprint backlog. The one final thing to mention about the sprint backlog and the sprint goal is what happens when the sprint goal becomes obsolete. By this I mean it's not worth progressing the sprint to achieve it any longer. An example of this might be a significant market shift that means your sprint goal is no longer relevant. In this example, solely at the product owner's discretion, the sprint is cancelled. This is a very rare and massively disruptive occurrence, but if it does happen, the Scrum team immediately move into sprint planning and restart the sprint with a new sprint goal. The key takeaways from this video are that firstly, the sprint backlog, the combination of the sprint goal, product backlog items, and plan for how to turn them into the increment is owned by the developers. Secondly, whilst the developers commit to achieving the sprint goal, they don't commit to individual product backlog items because at the start of the sprint, they don't know any of the problems that they may encounter. So they will adapt as needed. And finally, there is one sprint goal per sprint. It creates focus and coherence for the Scrum team, particularly the developers, and shows them respect by not changing what they are working towards.